So let's continue. As I mentioned, it's not called from the US Census Bureau by Amy O'Hara. She's going to explain how she's in a different branch of the Census Bureau, so I leave that up to her. So thanks for coming and thanks for your presentation.
Thanks, I'm really glad to be here. I just want to explain a little bit about where I am in the agency relative to Bill. We're both actually in the Directorate for Research and Methodology. But where Bill focuses a lot on the theory and the methods, my group focuses on the operations and the practice. So I have a staff of 20 people that deal with getting the data in. So we deal with the lawyers, and we deal with the privacy officers, and it's a lot of paperwork to get access to these data with identifiers so that you can even do linkage. And the rest of that staff, it's a production staff. So we have a methodology where we're taking these data and we're getting them ready to satisfy the users. And there are users within the agency that need this for operations, for frame development, for imputation, but it's also all of the research users. So the Census Bureau has a set of enclaves across the country where people can come in and use the restricted data, and it's data that no longer have the social security numbers. She just got access. She just smiled at me, and I'm like, oh my God, I created an account for her. So we have people come in that are going to get access to these data so that they can do projects, and it's a lot of social scientists, and they're producing scholarly work. So I want to talk a bit about the United States. It doesn't have a system of registers, and it does not have a Statistics Act. So unlike many other countries that enjoy access to the data that you want to link together, we're at a bit of a disadvantage. We also have an uneven relationship with the people that hold the data. There's no National Health Service in the United States, so if you want to go after health data, you have to go after the government, healthcare providers, or you have to go to the individual insurance companies. And it's very difficult. And it's a very different culture as well in terms of people's willingness to have the government access their data or researchers access their data. It's also a huge country, so whenever you're talking, and Bill was pointing this out, if you're looking at the unit of geography, the census block, there are a lot of them. So it's a big country, it has some huge urban areas, and then it has these huge areas that are rural. And so that affects the data that we have available to do matching with. And there are a lot of residents. So that's the other thing. So whenever we're talking about doing a linkage, if you're going to try to do the whole country, you have to have the right compute. So despite those limitations I just mentioned, we have built some products within the agency. The master address file is the closest thing we have to an address register. So we're getting data from our postal service, and we're also doing canvassing. So we have people out there, humans in the field, collecting data and pulling it all together into this master address file. And so within a structure, if it's a multi-unit structure, we're trying to assign a unique ID to each apartment within it. We want that to be the basis for our household surveys. It's also the basis for the population census that we do every 10 years. We have something called a business register that largely uses data from our revenue agency, which is called the Internal Revenue Service. So that's all of the tax data that are being fed into that organization are legally shared with the Census Bureau so that we can use that as the foundation for our business surveys and also the economic census that we do every 5 years. We've gone state by state getting access to unemployment insurance wage information, so the earnings that covered workers get, and we've created this thing that's an employer-employee database. The United States did this. There are some other European countries, the Germans did this. And so we built that, and that's very useful because you can see the labor market realities in small areas around the country. So how do we mitigate the fact we don't have a Statistics Act? Well, we work at the Census Bureau, and it's one of the only government agencies that enjoys access to data under our existing statute. So I have the ability to ask almost anyone for their data. But we don't have a Statistics Act, so they can tell me no. They can say, I will not share my data because I have a prohibition in my state, or I read the statute and I don't think I can share it, or they can just have an unwillingness to share the data. So that's a bit of a challenge for us. And how do we deal with the fact that some of the data providers are less willing to share the information? We're trying to make something in it for them. So make them want to share the data with us. This particularly happened with the ex-offender data, so the prison data in the United States. The people who held that data, they had it for administrative purposes, but there were questions that they wanted to answer that we could answer by doing linkage projects. So by creating a joint research agenda, we gave them an incentive to share their data with us. That was still a multi-year negotiation to get an agreement for them to share the data. And the data are very tightly held, but it was still a big step forward in terms of getting the agreement in the first place. So in terms of the size of the United States, we've done a big match to see if the federal data sources that we have and some of the data we can buy, is it similar to a population register? Is it enough to say we could use this for a census operation? And so we did a study, and we're getting substantial coverage, but not universal coverage. And to the question that was asked in Bill's talk, who are we not matching? Where is the bias? So either who are the people that aren't present in the files, or who are the people that we're having a lot of trouble linking? And so we've done some of that work using the American Community Survey to understand the types of people, the characteristics that seem to be driving that lack of linkability. So I just wanted to put up, not to read this, but it's proof that the United States is supposed to be going out there and getting data from federal agencies, from state agencies, from private companies, and it's the last line that I want you to focus on. We have that authority because we are supposed to do that instead of conducting direct inquiries. So we have this access to the data so that we are reducing the burden and reducing the cost of producing statistics. And the word statistics is really important here as well, because as the principal statistical agency in the United States, we're only allowed to use these data to measure the population and economy. Now that's a pretty broad mission, measuring the population and economy, but we are not using the data for enforcement, we are not using the data for surveillance, and we are not using the data for marketing. So that is how we enjoy access to the data with direct identifiers, and to date, we've been pulling it into the agency. So until those PPRL methods really develop and mature, that the data can live in their own agencies, our method has been to be that trusted entity that brings in this highly sensitive data into the servers that my staff work on, and then we do the linkage and prepare something that's still very sensitive, but not as radioactive as what came in the door. And so that's part of what we're doing. Now, when we've done that, we took the 2010 census and we compared it to a composite that was constructed of data from a bunch of federal agencies and a couple of commercial files that we bought. And so we put that together, and the sum total of those external data sources, we had just over 2 billion records, and we matched it to the 308 million people that were in the census. And so you can see that the purple areas are where we found the counties, where we found at least 95% of those county residents in the combined administrative data by linking, for the people that enumerated in the census. You can see the parts of the country are blue and purple, and so that's where we had higher match rates, and parts are not. Well, our match rates were dependent on name, date of birth, and address. And as was described earlier, there can be a lot of common names and dates of birth, and also a lot of people unwilling to share their full first name or share their first name at all. You get a lot of fake names, and so we're reliant on doing that blocking on geography in order to help us narrow down that search space to try to find the links. But the parts of the country that have a lot of orange in particular, they are rural parts of the country, so they're not city-style addresses. People may live throughout that county and collect their mail at a post box, or there may be rural route boxes where they pick up their mail. So that lack of the ability to identify the same address unit in both files was really hampering our progress, because just matching on name and date of birth alone was you couldn't resolve to the person. So what sort of data sources are we using? The first column, these are data from federal agencies in the US. And to give you a sense there, in that first column, we're talking about employment, we're talking earnings, we're talking disability, pension payments from our Social Security Administration, welfare payments from the Health and Human Services, people that are receiving rent assistance, so housing subsidies, or federal loan help for buying a house. The Bureau of Justice data are those prisoners that I mentioned, and also the Postal Service, which has all of that address data, the Office of Personnel Management for federal employees like us, and then Selective Service still exists in the United States to register young men in case there needs to be a draft. So that's a lot of data, and virtually everything in that column comes in with a 9-digit number called a Social Security number. So if you want to join across those, great. You can pretty much do a deterministic match, and because many of those lists exist for benefit or enforcement purposes, they're very complete. So if you want to get health insurance when you're over 65, you have an incentive to give the right information to the government. When you're paying taxes, assuming that you don't want to get in trouble, you have an incentive to give the right information to the government. Now for taxes, there could be people that are non-compliant, so you have a coverage problem, but the people that are in the data system, it's very high quality data. Now let's move to the center column, the state data. In the United States, a lot of our welfare programs are run at the state. The government gives them a bunch of money and says, handle your people. The data systems are all different. Sometimes they are different within a state. The state of California has 6 different systems offering food security to their residents. And so they have trouble pulling the data together into one place, let alone sharing it forward to the Census Bureau so that we can do studies. So the first program there is SNAP. It's what we used to call food stamps, and then unemployment insurance, and the third is another food program. These are sort of safety net programs for the most part. And to obtain the data, we are going state by state, negotiating with different departments within the state, and there is a huge data harmonization problem there. So when someone asks Bill what the big problem is, for me, I have a problem with ingest. I have a problem with ETL. I have a problem with schema harmonization. I have a problem with data systems that change. The state of Texas changed their IT vendor, and they lost continuity across their welfare file. They didn't even know if the same people were receiving benefits. So that was an opportunity for us to step in and say, would you like us to help? Because we had all these other data sources that could help us bridge that gap with them. And so again, a lot of times doing these projects and getting people willing to share data for Linkage, there has to be something in it for them, helping them solve a problem or helping them gain insight into these programs. Because especially in that center column, the states know who's receiving benefits, but they don't know who is eligible but not applying. And so that's something that we've been able, through Linkage, to help them understand so that they can target outreach better. Now the flip side of that coin, in a country that has the partisan divisions the United States does, some people want to end waste, fraud, and abuse. So when you do that linkage, you can also identify where there's churning or there seem to be individuals registered for the same benefit program across states. And the way that our data are set up, if you're only looking at your state's data, you may not know that somebody is dipping into that well across multiple states. So again, statistical purpose means that we can't identify that John Doe is doing that, but we can help them understand the extent to which that is happening and potentially the characteristics of that sort of pattern appearing in the data. Now the third column there, third-party data. These are files that we can go out and buy. You could go out and buy them too. But the problem is they typically cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you get them in, you don't know what you're looking at, you don't know the provenance of the data, you don't know the coverage, you don't know what they've done to it. It's a matter of figuring out what value it has, okay? Some of the files are quite good. They have better foreclosure data than we do because they go out and aggregate it from all of the places in the United States that have had those events. They also aggregate other public records such as property taxes or deeds. And that's nice, they pull it together in one place. But the example I like to use, when I did the study that resulted in that colorful map, I asked all of the vendors, please sell me your file representing the United States population as of April 1, 2010. And one of the vendors sold me a file that had 650 million people in it. Now we had just spent $10 billion to figure out the United States had 308 million people. And they sent me a file that had obviously a lot of dupes or a lot of garbage, right? And so the question is, how much time, how much energy, how much money am I going to spend to try to figure out what was going on in that file, right? And so again, being able to pull it in and have it properly documented, and what my staff is doing is trying to produce working papers, trying to produce documentation to let the next user downstream know what is in that file, is there any utility? But utility is really hard because you have to consider whether that file is fit for your use, not his use, not her use. Because somebody may come in and say, that's exactly what I was looking for. Maybe not that one, but other files. The first thing on there is contact. We're a statistical agency. We conduct surveys and data collections. And so this is where we go out and we buy lists that have persons' names, phone numbers, and addresses. And this has been, it was kind of an operational product, but it's been fascinating to monitor over time as more and more households in the United States are going they're getting rid of their landlines and their cell only. And it's something that is becoming a very, very important matching variable now that you can keep your cell phone number. It used to be that when you changed carriers, you got a new number. But now that that number follows you from carrier to carrier, it's actually becoming a persistent linkage key for us to take a look at. It's funny because phone numbers used to be used almost in blocking, that you would look at the area code for where you live. So if I grew up in Pittsburgh, I would have 412, and you would expect that to be just the Pittsburgh locality. But cell phones have blown that out of the water because now I could be living anywhere with a phone that was issued there. So the way that we're using phone data has been changing over time, and it's important to have people in the data. It's also important to continue getting a lot of data to be able to observe these trends, not just looking in one little pile, but looking at the United States as a whole. So with all of those sources that I just went through, what do we have and what are we missing? We have a lot of people that have economic activity because we have all of that revenue data. We have the tax data, their tax returns, the statements from their employers and financial institutions. Again, the workers in covered employment are in there and the people paying their taxes. You have the older population because they're getting the government health insurance, the people that are getting the housing assistance, but the people we're missing, and this was borne out in a study we did with the bias of who we're able to link, right? So it's the people that are missing from these files that are hampering our ability to validate who they are and use them in matching. There's people that are disconnected, so people who are not in the labor force, people who are not on any social programs that we're observing the data for, and children not claimed on tax forms. In the United States, you get a social security number at birth. It's called enumeration at birth, and you are registered with our social insurance agency, but then that's it. You pretty much don't appear again until later in your life when you start working, or if you have a disability whenever you're going to the government to try to get benefits. But children are often claimed on tax returns. But if a parent isn't claiming them, those children are kind of missing from our view. In the United States, there are very firm privacy laws about student records. And so when a child gets into pre-K or kindergarten, so around age 5 and up, there are data, but the data are locked down at the states, and it's very difficult to get them because there is currently a prohibition on having a student unit record database. So sometimes the laws that we have in place are a challenge, even for the Department of Education, that would benefit from having more information linkable, but instead it's fragmented in all of these different states with different IT systems, with different schema. It's kind of a recurring theme I'm going to have here. Residents without SSN. So in the United States, when people come in, they may not have a social security number, and that may be legal or it may be illegal. Either way, if they aren't in that file, and that's one of the main things we're using in our matching, that's going to be very difficult for us. And finally, mobile and transient populations. When I showed you that map and there were the areas that had the orange, and I said because there are places that we don't have good addresses, well, people who change their address are equally large a challenge for us. So we're getting all of these data in. We know somewhat of the limitations, and what are we doing with this? And this is going to overlap a little bit with what Bill's talking about, but because I have the operations, I'm going to be describing more kind of how we work through it. There are limitations. I would love better methods to do this, but it doesn't change the fact that I have people that 5 days a week are processing data. We've processed 470 files this year. I just had that number presented to me, and that's amazing. And last year we processed 300. And when I say one file, one of them could be Medicaid, which is our health insurance program for low-income individuals. That's coming in from every state every month. And I'm counting that as one. So you have to make sure that you have a script and they're not changing their IT systems, because those data just have to be able to flow through and get processed and get placed in the warehouse. And so that's what my group is doing. The front end of that, of course, is parsing, standardization, and assessing the missingness in the data for when you want to link it. So I hope you can see some of this. You guys were saying that nicknames mess things up, and I'm going to make a case that sometimes what we do to addresses mess things up. The Census Bureau spends a lot of time with this. We have an entire geography division. But as places are changing in the United States and we come up with different and more colorful ways to name our new developments, it's interesting when you see what our standardizers are going to do here and also how it's even going to be parsed. So on the left side there, I have the most frequent street suffix, address suffixes there. You can see street and road and avenue are very high. And over here, this is the lower end. And so, Pine Bluff or Daisy Spur. So these are the other ones. And the first column is what the full word is, and the second column is what we're going to get in there and abbreviate it to so that we can pass it through our matcher. And that sounds well and good. And then you start looking at streets like this. And so when it's going through, and imagine these with or without their spaces, because depending on which of all of those sources, we got 450 files, 470 files in this year. If one of them said Bay Ridge instead of Bay Space Ridge, what is going to be happening here? And so we want to make sure that our old school matching approach is addressing these multi-word addresses, and also to make sure that the standardization is doing what we want it to do. It would be great if we had more flexible ways to just go in there and grab the whole string, but sometimes there's all sorts of other nonsense in these fields. When someone gives you a string, you take what they give you and you say thank you. Our revenue agency for a married return has the spouses in one row, and we need to parse them, okay? And that's typically easier if they share the same last name. But if it's a couple from an ethnicity that they're still using maternal, paternal, you have this string of names, and you look at it and you say, I'm going to draw the line there, and someone else might equally draw the line, one name to the left or two names to the right. It just depends on who is applying their best knowledge to draw that line. But that's probably the most egregious example, because there's two people and you have to figure out how to divide them apart. And that's a huge file. That's 145 million returns a year. It's one of the bedrocks of a lot of the studies that we use. So for names, we're doing a project, my colleague Trent Alexander, to try to recover the names from the 1990 census to match it. And in 1990, we conducted a census. But back then, we didn't think we would need the names, so we copied them onto microfilm, but we didn't digitize them. And so the forms were not designed for data capture for those names, but we'd really like them. We would like to get them and be able to apply our matching to them and match across more censuses. Okay, because we've already matched the 2000 and the 2010. I'll show you some results from that. But when we're doing that, we're trying to figure out how will you know if that optical mark recognition is working. So we wanted to give the academics that are trying to digitize this information a name list. And we say, oh yeah, we have a name list. Here's the one we get from the Social Security Administration. And that's the top row there. These are all Social Security numbers ever issued. And there are 5.6 million unique first names, and there are 10.7 million last names. And they said, well, that's just too many. We don't want that many. And so for the first time, we looked at how we would trim this down so they could get something that they would be able to fit into their modeling to help them resolve these entities. And so we were really looking to see how often some of these names are appearing. And of course, you could keep going down this list, but I think it's informative whenever earlier we were talking about that 581 for the Bloom filter, that what are you going to be putting in there? And with a country as large as the United States, with the names that are appearing, especially in ethnic enclaves where you could have a whole lot of people sharing the same name, you have to make sure that the rest of the information that you're putting into that key is complete and accurate, because otherwise you're going to be giving this methodology to the people holding the data, and you're not sure what they're going to say there isn't enough information to match, which I think of as the cutting room floor problem. When someone says, oh, it's missing first name, I'm not even going to put it through the matcher. Well, maybe there was other information, maybe there's auxiliary information. So it's making sure that you're considering what is the problem and where are you hitting complexities. And so this is just the Social Security file that we have, and we want to do a lot more research into names. We have colleagues at our sister agency, the National Center for Health Statistics, and they have done nicknames on Hispanic names. And so they've done a bunch of work looking into uniqueness and the way that those names are being recorded on forms. So the same individual might put their maternal name on this form, and at a different application they might use the paternal name. And so you're actually looking at the same individual, but they have self-identified in different ways with different names. So how do you deal with that? We have nickname lookups, and they are Anglo ones. But the people at this health agency have done that with Hispanic names because it's really important whenever they're trying to do their matching, because some of their programs, they have done separate data collection in Texas or in California, places that have very, very large Hispanic populations. So they wanted to make sure they were paying attention to that. We face a similar problem with Asian names, because they're often short and we have lots and lots of multiple hits and they're exact matches. So what are you going to do? That's really what was driving us to look into matching that involved looking at the rest of the people in the household, so not just looking at them as independent rows and thinking of who they are with. And so that's going to nudge us into the direction of a graph, who you're with, and you have to make sure you understand at the point in time who you're with, because that's of course going to evolve. But I think that that's going to be an exciting area for us to get into. So I was just talking about names, now let's talk about where you don't have names. I like matching. I like matching persons, so I like having names. So in the census, I was very upset in the second column there when I saw that we had over 10 million records that didn't have names. So those are pretty much off the table if I'm doing person matching. And I was like, well, why don't they have names? And so 2 million of those provided their other information, including their age or date of birth, and they didn't provide names all the time for the other household members, but it wasn't just a pretty much blank census. They just didn't want to tell the government their name. And then 2.1 million were proxy responses, meaning you weren't home, so that they asked your neighbor. And the neighbor said, there's a guy that lives there, he's about 30, but they didn't know his name. And then 6 million of them were through census processing. So it's unclear whether there were partial pieces that didn't look like names, but they blotted them out, or they had multiple entries for the same housing unit, so they didn't keep any of the names, they just kept a count. And so it would be great if we were able to get a better handle on why this happens and how we could prevent it, because we like doing matching. We want to be able to enrich these files. And really for the American census coming up in 2020, it's going to be necessary because we're going to be using data linkage to fill in missing information when people are skipping over items. So if you give us the name and the count in your household, but you don't tell us the characteristics, we are going to employ matching, and we're going to find out your age, your race, your sex, and your Hispanic origin. So that's something that we're going to do. So having name, and we will have address, but having name is going to be really critical. Third-party data. I already said on that slide that had the 3 columns, the third party, you're not real sure what you're going to get. Here's an example. We bought 7 files in 2010 to compare them, and you can these sum across the row, and you can see that the percent missing date of birth completely is very high. The one that has 96% missing, that was actually a wireless file, so I'm not trying to fault them, but just to give you an example, the companies, they probably have it. Are they selling it to you? And when they sell it to you, is it filled? And this is the chart that shows that sometimes part of it is filled and sometimes none of it is filled. So if you're going to be attempting person matching, and this is the sort of information that you're investing in, it can be very challenging. So what are we trying to do with these data? Ideally, with all those federal files, we're going to take the social security number, the name, and the date of birth information, and we're going to validate it to make sure that it wasn't somebody misusing another person's identity to be employed. We're going to validate addresses per that master address file that we have built through all the data from the Postal Service. And we have a system that is a production system taking those person fields, taking the address fields, and applying unique IDs so that this enables deduplication and matching for the downstream users. And we're looking into ways to improve this. We've done some studies of the bias inherent in our processing, but this is what we're doing, and it seems to be working. It works very well on those federal files because they come in with such complete identifiers, but on the files that don't have social security number, we're typically able to validate the information for more than 90% of the records. This is very, very small, I know that. But we are going to be sharing this information. It's just to show, as Bill was mentioning in just the previous talk, we are an example of a Filegi-Sunter probabilistic matching that has cascading modules. Did you get matched in the first part? No. We're going to send you to the second part. Did you get matched in the second part? No. We're going to send you to the third. And so there are different combinations of blocking strategies and variables that you're attempting to match on. And when you get all the way to the bottom, you have some records that still didn't get matched. Okay? And the first data column there, you can see the number that was validated there was only 70%. That's the slide that I just showed you, that it was missing date of birth or had incomplete date of birth for so many people. So that's really hurting that one. The center column is our Medicare file for people 65 and older. As I said, you have an incentive for the government to have the right information, and that comes in and we're able to validate nearly all of the records there. And the third one is the decennial census. And of all of those records, including the 10 million that didn't have names, we were able to validate the information. That's take the name, date of birth, and address and find it in that Social Security file for 90% of them. And if you take out the ones that we were taking off the table because they were missing name, that's 93%, which is not bad. I mean, it's a big country. That's 312 million records that we started out with at the top there. So this shows that the first two columns have a bunch of data filled there with SSN, and the third column is a 0. And that's because in the United States, for our censuses and surveys, we do not collect Social Security number. So it is purely probabilistic matching, looking for unique matches on name, date of birth, and address, and who you live with now that we're incorporating that. So when we're doing this, we know there's error. We know there's error in the way that we're doing it and the way that we're using it. We're trying to understand that. We've done the Bellin model, and I agree with Bill. The mixture model doesn't fit great, and so we were like, okay, well, we've at least tried to do that to study it, because we don't have great truth data there, no good training data. But what we did was that previous slide that had data, and zeros, we took files that either provided Social Security numbers or some of those vendors sold us Social Security numbers, and then we ran the matching with those, and then we took them out. And so we know that there is bias in the group that we're using, but at least we were able to do that simulation. And depending on which file you're looking at, that shows that we have a false match rate of very small to much higher. Now that much higher one is coming out of one of those commercial files. And the commercial files, in addition to having a lot of missing data, you don't really understand where they're getting data from. So if I was applying for a rebate from an electronics store and they asked my age and I said that I was 23, then that's the information they would have sold to us. So the accuracy there may have caused false matches as well, because we just don't know exactly where it came from. Missed matches, of course, are a problem where there really were true links there and we can't find them. A lot of times that's happening because whenever we're setting our parameters, we're fairly conservative, okay? And there could be multiple matches that would resolve if we had additional auxiliary information, or we could change the way that we're setting those parameters. But we know that if there is something that there are multiple records that look like a match, we don't select any of them if those scores are very close. And as I mentioned before, we've done some studies on who is less likely to receive one of these PICs, these person-validated IDs. And it's the groups that you would kind of expect that they're difficult to match. They're often difficult to find in censuses and surveys as well. So this is an overview of, just recapping. We go out and we get data, and we make sure that we have a legal agreement stating how we're going to use it, because it's highly sensitive. And then we go through all of that data preparation and linkage that I just walked you through, and then the data are available for projects. And so when I mentioned that we are operations and practice, we're practitioners both as researchers, mostly social science research, but also practitioners for the states that need to run these programs. And so if you're running a food security program and you want to understand more about the people that are receiving your benefits, you can come to us and we will link data and write research reports for you. So all of our projects have to state why we're doing the join and what we're going to produce. So this is part of our governance process for doing data linkage, because I know that most of this workshop is talking about doing it, but you can't lose sight of the fact why you are doing it and who is going to raise eyebrows when they find out that you are doing it. So one of the studies that we did took the 2000 census and the 2010 census and matched them at the person level. And again, there is no national ID number, so this was done just on the strength of name, address, and date of birth. And so when we did that, we ended up with like 170 million matches, which was huge. The last studies that had looked at this topic, which is racial fluidity, are you changing your racial identification over time, is what this is about. They had been qualitative studies. And so we were talking about really small n's, and here we are with this massive data set that enabled us to look at this across the entire country and for a lot more race groups than had been done in the past. And so what they found was that if you were white or black or Asian, it was fairly consistent. But if you were two or more races, or you identified as multiple race, if you were American Indian, if you were Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, it was moving all over the place. And we were able to look at people who started identifying or who stopped identifying with a particular race group. And so for the first time, we were able to do that measurement. Not only is it neat from a demographic perspective, this is really important if you're a practitioner in the government, because people often say, are health clinics reaching people of all races equally? And so you want to know that answer, and you also want to know if the characteristic defining that answer is fluid and where it is fluid. And this was especially important, and it spurred a follow-on study that was published looking particularly at American Indian and Alaska Native, so our indigenous peoples. And so their movements were very interesting to look at, and it had to do with whether they were living near one of the tribal lands. And so there was a lot of really interesting social science research that this linkage enabled. What else can we do? This one was, I will say this was hard. So we got data from universities. For the first time, universities were piping in their data on individuals, so professors, graduate students, and vendors who were supported by federal research grants. And so this is really a study of innovation. What happens downstream of those federal research dollars? So you could look at different outcomes here. One outcome is what happens to the employment and the wages of the students that were on those grants. Another thing is to look at their CVs for their publications. Another is to look at patent applications. But for this particular study, they were looking at if you were on a grant and you were in a STEM program, what were the outcomes for those graduate students? The reason I say that this was difficult, the first deliveries of data the universities gave us were names. Name and university. We did not get age. We did not get date of birth. We did not get where that individual lived. And so that's scant matching fodder, you know? And so what did we do? We said, well, it's at this university. Let's say it's at this university. We had to make assumptions that there were going to be these concentric rings that you would hope that that student lived within. And then you would start trying to match for that student. And we've since convinced the universities to start sharing a little bit of age information. And when we got one of them to agree, we could demonstrate that that made the match quality so much better, the match rate and the match quality so much better. And then we started tweaking it to see if we could look for their earnings records. But we're still working on that because of the data silos that were mentioned earlier this morning, that the data that have the wage records identifying that this is the university name are not always available to the other parts within the same organization. So I can see wages, but I can't always see the employer ID. So this is one that is still evolving. When we started getting the date of birth, the match rate stabilized, and we felt that they could do research like this that got published. But those early days, it was just it was kind of exciting. It was very experimental, but it made you scratch your head and think, in urban areas, is this even worth doing? You know, if you're looking at a rural area that has one university, and you can imagine that most people live nearby, but if you're talking about New York University, people could be living wherever they can afford to live, so those areas can get quite large. Here's another example, and this uses that employer-employee data I mentioned way at the beginning. This is a good example of how you get other agencies excited about your products. So we have employer-employee data, but FEMA, our Federal Emergency Management Administration, whatever the A stands for, they're the ones for emergency planning. There's going to be a flood, there's going to be a hurricane. They got data shipped to us to be joined to this thing so that when there is a big weather event coming, we can estimate the impact for the employers and also the employees, since we know who is working at which establishments and roughly where they live. So we can start to estimate where there is going to be economic impact from these major weather events. And so we create this product called On the Map. This is the one for emergency management. There's also On the Map for economic development. and people can click around there and they can drill in, and this is something where you can really get a lot of buy-in for the results of data linkage, okay? And we know that there are people that aren't in that link, right? But there's a lot of interest in the people that were linked, but it's important to continue trying to measure that linkage error and the bias for the individuals that aren't represented. So what are we doing beyond that? How can we continue engaging with more agencies? In the United States, in a rare move of cooperation in our Congress with our president, a bill was signed into law in March of this year, setting up the Evidence-Based Policymaking Commission. So this is a group of people looking at whether and how data linkage can be used to inform policymakers. So the alternative there should be, well, what have they been using to make policy? But we're going to focus on what they will use, assuming that we can use more data linkage to inform policy. And so they're actually digging in. They met yesterday, or they met Friday, not yesterday. And they had Cynthia Dwork talking about privacy. So they're bringing in people that are informing them, and they will write recommendations on how there could be a data inventory, data infrastructure, database security, statistical protocols to take the big federal data sets that I mentioned and get them more widely available to practitioners like evaluators, administrators, and researchers so that we can inform policymakers. And so this would be a big step forward for the United States, and it's a huge opportunity. We're very excited. And there are a number of federal agencies saying, well, we don't really know what happens to individuals after they finish their service to the Army. Could you help us? And so that's very exciting. Do we say, yes, well, we would like to try, and until we get the data, we don't know what we're going to find in terms of that match. But that's an example of an agreement that we recently signed, because right now the Army knows when people separate, but they have no idea what happens. They have no idea if the investments that they're making to train people prior to their departure from the Army, you know, whether it's training in IT or training as a nurse's aide, whatever it is, they don't know if there's the same payoff from the training that they're offering as there would be through other educational opportunities had the individuals not been in the Army. So we're very excited about that. So what are the challenges? These have pretty much been covered. I expect we'll be talking more about them this week. Attributes and identifiers. What is unique to a person that is not changing over time? How do we obtain access to that? Should we obtain access to that? When will PPRL be good enough that we don't have to touch it? But if we do get there, how will we know if it's a good match? You know, if we never see. So I'm excited but skeptical about that. Errors. I would like a better way to understand the error in what I'm doing, in addition to better ways to do the matching. Scalability. So we're already, you know, we have a lot of parallel processes running, but to date, because of the sensitivity of the data that I've been describing, the United States government has not said, put that in the cloud. So we're trying to figure out how we can get to a place that would really allow some of the cutting edge linkage approaches to be tested on real data to scale. So as you guys are developing new methodologies and it's working on a little data set, you know, you could come to us and I would say, would you like to test that on a state? And that might work. But if you test it on a state and that state doesn't have a lot of Hispanics or has too many Hispanics, you don't know what it's going to do whenever you blast it out to the whole United States. And so that's a challenge right there. Disclosure avoidance. As we are joining more data sets, are we going to continue being able to release the products that we've been releasing? In the United States, we release public use files. We release a microdata sample of our decennial census, and we release microdata from our surveys. So we already are doing a lot of de-identification work. We do some swapping. There are a lot of different disclosure avoidance methodologies that we deploy. But as we're getting into this world where there's more matching being done, we want to make sure that we aren't, you know, making the mosaic effect worse with the data that are out there, the data that we're churning out there, and the data that we had always been releasing. Access to data. The word de-identified is so polarizing right now because people say, I de-identified the data. Well, that means a different thing to different communities. There's a big discussion in the United States right now going on with HIPAA, with our health data. They gave de-identification standards, but are they good enough? No, and how long is that going to hold? And once you release the information, that genie's out of the bottle. You can't put it back in. So should this be something that is only done through some sort of licensing or data enclave? What arrangements are best? And we've assessed best practices in the US. That commission that I mentioned, they are very deeply interested in figuring out the right ways to have data access. And then acceptance, which I'll get to in a minute. It has to do with what the public thinks about our doing this. Because to do linkage, that means I have access to all of these identifiers and all of these identified files. And I hope that I'm doing it for the public good. You know, I have to demonstrate that I am, otherwise I can't get a project approved. I just want to make sure that the public understand that and agree. We're looking for lessons that other countries have learned. So in 2013, which was the year that I could get information from all these different countries aligned, the US had 316 million people. So Norway, they have great data, they have registers, they have them all linked up. But they have a population in 13 of 5.1 million, which is roughly the size of the state of Maryland, okay? Sweden, just under 10 million. It's about the size of New Jersey, one of our states. Netherlands, 16 million, it's about the size of Florida. Canada, 35 million, it's about the size of California. So whenever we're looking at best practices, we're looking at population sizes that have to do with really one of the US states. And I looked up the UK, and the UK population is the size of the Midwest, so the little collection of Midwestern states in the United States. That doesn't include California or Texas or Florida or New York, which are some of our major population centers. So thinking through the scale problems that these other countries have and how they're going to be magnified when we do it, and also the diversity, the types of names we have, the melting pot that we have in the United States. Sometimes it makes matching easier because we have some very unique names, and sometimes it adds different complexities. So beginning to understand that is really important. So back to that acceptance. I don't think that we're going to get the public to accept what we're doing unless they become aware of it. And when they become aware of it, I want them to see what we're really doing, not what they think we're doing. Okay? So there's a difference between their perception and the reality. We put some questions on a recurring poll in the United States called the Gallup poll, asking people about where they think their data are, what they think the government is doing, and it was tied to a trust in government study. So this is a recurring data collection we've been doing. 58% think the government already shares a central database. My job would be so much easier if we did, but we don't, okay? But it's that perception. They think that we already have it, and then news stories like I'll allude to in a minute here, the NSA, part of the government has it, but they're using it for a very different purpose than what I'm talking about. And also that the way they perceive these different data types varies. So some data types have a different sensitivity. And when you ask about their health records or their employment records or their affinity cards, you know, like you have one for the market so that you get 50 cents off of your milk, the data from those vendors, how they perceive the use of that information and their personal privacy. And that gets down to attitudes. So we asked people, is it okay if we use these administrative data for these different fields? We asked them, is it okay if we use the data from your employer instead of collecting it on this survey? And they said, no, get it from me. And we said, well, what if we get that information from your neighbor? Would you rather have us get it from your neighbor or get it from your employer? And they said, get it from the records, don't talk to my neighbor about me. So a lot of this has to do with how you're framing their reaction, and we're trying to gather that information. The last piece on attitudes is that someone's attitude may be different than their behavior. I might tell you, I don't like that, but when it actually comes time to fill out a survey, and they say, you can fill out the survey for the next 15 minutes, or you can give me your consent to go get the information from somewhere else, my attitude and my behavior may be a bit different there, or it may be evolving over time. So finally, the attitudes is tied to this trust in government study. And back in 2013, when The Guardian had the big story on Edward Snowden, happened to be when we were collecting the trust in government poll. And you can see that in July is when the biggest part of that story broke, but it had been evolving all during that spring and summer. And so this is, it's a nice example. We have a similar graph when our Office of Personnel Management had the huge breach and all of the federal employees' data was compromised, and you can say trust in government. There was a similar one when our Internal Revenue Agency was accused of some partisan activities with nonprofits, and you can see trust in government dips. When you see this over a long time, it doesn't recover. So that may not surprise you when you read news about the United States, but it's really important for the sort of work that I'm doing, that I want people to think that I'm using it for legitimate purposes and that having access to this wealth of data is really in the public interest and in their interest. And so that's something that we are working on informing them and hopefully making them more comfortable with it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Very good. I have a few questions. Runner, bring it back.
We said if you want to test your method, come to us.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's recorded.
Okay, but I'm not like, I don't have the big data sandbox that they have in Ireland, and I would love to be able to get some data in there. Our data can't leave home, so we would have to find a way to do it, but there are ways.
Thank you.
Yes?
So is it, so I know, I'm from the US, so I know that the census has RDCs.
Yep.
Is that a sandbox where if you're from the US and you have access to an RDC that would be so that it would be faster versus somebody who doesn't? Or is that, because my understanding of the typical RDC is not that data, it's the de-identified data.
Right. For linkage, we are creating a new sandbox because we need better methods here.
Yep.
And we're trying to figure out, it's unlikely those data are going to go into the RDC right away, but we have a lovely headquarters right outside of Washington, D.C. And that's where people can come visit us.
So the answer is, even if you're in the US and you have access to an RDC, that's not for this, right?
Well, if you want to do bias studies and you could do that in the RDC, but if you want to get in there and do some nitty-gritty linkage where you need you need us to expose identifiers,
Gotta
that's
be
us.
indeed.
Unless you guys can really ramp up your progress on the Bloom filters, and then we'll use that.
I get it.
Any questions?
Any questions?
Yeah.
I'm pleased that you have seen that huge variation in names,
Yes.
and that you think of, well, reducing that variability, that variation. That may be in conflict with Bill's view that you should not standardize any data. So how do you solve that conflict?
No.
Is there no conflict?
Well, it depends. If I'm doing something for operations and a file is coming in and they literally need a 24-hour turnaround. They need the data to come from its source agency, and they need it turned around, and they need it in the operations environment to support real-time queries. So we are, constantly appending to the data that these operations are using. We want to have the data in the form that's easiest for that operation to use. And so this gets back to what I said about fitness for use. So if somebody can ask us, we want the data prepared in this way, unless there is some reason that we absolutely say, no, I think that's a terrible idea, we will try to make it match up with what their priority is. But with some of these things, I think that we need to be looking at the information that's coming in and trying to use it more in its native form. Even the couples that I mentioned. There's instead of saying, I'm going to get it parsed into these fields that I like to glue together this many tokens and I'm going to look for a match on a string, to do something that's more experimental than that in the short run, to try to use all of the information instead of chopping it up.
I don't think Bill said it about standardization. I think he said the nicknames is the problem matter, but I think you would advocate standardizing.
Always. But and related to the nicknames, 3 different times our population division has provided lists of Hispanic nicknames to our decennial area. Okay, and I mostly cut them out. The reason is because the errors that Randall referred to and others. The problem is also with the Hispanic, the Puerto Rican nicknames are different than the Mexican, they're different from the Colombian.
But that's why our colleagues and I hope that their paper's out, it was probably done at a joint statistical meetings session. They actually went through and looked at the people from the Dominican Republic, people from Puerto Rico, people from Mexico, people from the various parts of South America, and what the nickname differences were. So, something like that, you can't do anything, you can't run that through any sort of, sounds like, whenever the nicknames look so completely different from what the given name probably was.
There was a group about 20 years ago at Georgetown University that actually created a very, very large system to do that. And then subsequently IBM purchased it. In IBM's context, it didn't work that well either.
Mm-hmm. The drift in names is very concerning if you're a matcher. And we also did a study looking at what I'll describe as the drift in gender. And so we had often used the male-female flag from the Social Security Administration as a check. As Bill was saying, you have Robbie, is it Roberta, or is it Robert? And we started looking at people who were changing their name formally with the government, and then some of them were also changing their sex on there. But that agency required for many years that if you were doing that, that you had actually transitioned. And so we did a paper looking at the administrative records, trying to see what, based on that file, the transgender population in the United States looked like. It can mess up linkage.
That isn't errors necessarily. Could it just be a typo on the forms that come in or in their databases? Where
It's
the
something
sex changes.
we looked into that, and we looked to see if when the change was happening. And so at issuance, if somebody changed it right away, we believe it's that. Or when somebody finally gets their own record and says, wait, they have my date wrong or they have my sex wrong, they would change it. But we're talking about changes that were also associated with somebody, changing their name with the system.
This is just an anecdote on that point. When I was a research assistant many years ago, we had a very small study, 200 people, community mental health patients, and we've been getting in all this data every month. And suddenly there was a 201st person in there, and this went on for a while, and we wondered, what the hell is going on here? And finally, the PI got on the phone to the doctors, and it turned out someone had transitioned, and one set of doctors had decided, we're going to get a new national health number for that person. The other set of doctors decided they're still the same person, they can keep on using the old one. So.
Wow.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks a lot for the questions and for both speakers. So we now